Next up, we're going to start diving into the presentations from all of you, starting with our management support tools. And I want to highlight a couple of requests that we have, especially for the in-person folks, the online folks. First and foremost, I'm going to start with in-person. If you are presenting in person, because we do have the virtual attendees as well, what we're hoping is that you can kind of just stay put, right? It makes it a little bit less exciting and visually stimulating to look at if you're in the room, because you can't wander all over the place, but we want to make sure that our virtual participants can see your face. So please do your best to try to stick right here. For the in-person folks, as a reminder, we will have Teal, who is sitting right in front of you, who is going to be putting up reminders on time. For those folks who are virtual, we have Charlie, who is going to be doing some thumbs up at your 2-minute warning, your 1-minute warning, and then some applause when you are at 7 minutes. Okay, so our hope is that that can kind of help keep us on schedule, but we will start doing a little bit of polite yelling at some point if you are too far over time. So with that, I am going to turn it over virtually to Joe Stewart, who's going to be talking to us about evidence-based tools for improved reforestation outcomes. So Joe, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Libby, and thanks for organizing this and having us all. So I'm talking about a couple different tools. Next slide. The first of which is the post-fire conifer reforestation. Who's controlling the slides? Oh, awesome. The post-fire conifer reforestation planning tool. And the main feature of this tool is predicting the probability of natural post-fire conifer regeneration within 60-meter plots. And we've got data for about 1,500 plots across 24 wildfires, primarily located in California. But the tool also includes features for a customizable prioritization interface with prioritization categories similar to the colors that you can see on the right-hand side of this slide. But if we look at the left-hand side of the slide, again, we can see that relatively simple models do a pretty darn good job with out-of-sample predictions of where conifers are going to regenerate on their own or not. This is leave one fire out cross-validation. And the main purpose, intended use of these predictions is to refine areas for deploying limited reforestation resources. If we look on the right-hand part of this slide again, we can see 3 different colors, and this plot focuses on all Forest Service lands in California, excluding redwood and pinyon juniper vegetation types. So the red type, red color is the Region 5 guidance. So that's the guideline from the region for reforesting all areas with greater than 50% basal area loss. But we can refine that further by looking at areas with higher fire severity and lower probabilities of natural conifer regeneration to really zero in on those areas that have the highest risk of vegetation type transition to non-coniferous vegetation types. And overall, what we can see from this plot is that post-fire reforestation need is accelerating. I don't think that's news to anybody here. But the other thing you can see overlaid on top of this is actual reforestation progress where it intersects with these categories and scored by the period post-fire. So we can see if we look back to the middle part of this period, starting in like 2005 to 2015, 15, 20 years ago, the majority of post-fire reforestation is happening within 3 years post-fire. And for recent big fire years, we don't have long windows, but we can see that just by that metric alone, there's huge untapped potential for post-fire reforestation. Okay, next slide. So this is the main tool and project that I've been working on, which is assisted gene flow for forests, the climate adapted seed tool. And so what we're looking at here in the scatter plot is data for common garden experiments where trees from lots of different locations are planted at common sites. And this scatter plot is showing data just for lodgepole pine, but we're working with data for about 15 different species across Western North America, spanning about 350,000 trees planted in these common garden experiments. And on the x-axis, we see the mean annual temperature difference. So that's site mean annual temperature minus seed source mean annual temperature. And what you see here is the scatter plot. Roughly what we see is about a bell-shaped curve. Trees that are planted in a climate that's similar to the population that those seeds are adapted to, the historical climate of the seed source, do best. And we get fairly drastic drop-off as we move to climates that differ from the climate that those seeds are adapted to. But you don't need fancy statistics to see this is the case. You can just look at this picture. This is from Greg O'Neill's yard in front of his office. This is a demonstration provenance test where you can see the height of these trees roughly corresponds to the right-hand side of that bell-shaped curve that you can see on the scatter plot there. Next slide, please. And if we developed a little bit more advanced models that account for multiple dimensions of climate change at once, we can create much more accurate predictions of how that climate adaptation mismatch, the mismatch between the climate that seeds are adapted to, the trees are adapted to, and the climate they're growing in is going to affect their growth rates. So on the left, we've got a three-dimensional representation of a climate transfer function. And on the right, what we see is fairly drastic predictions using a multi-dimensional climate transfer function of what's likely to happen not too far into the future under mean ensemble projections. So you can see lots of areas of California are projected to suffer sometimes in excess of a 50% decline in productivity. And that's important for a variety of reasons. But I think one of those is that trees that grow more slowly grow into size classes that are resistant to fire more slowly. And of course, they also sequester less carbon and produce less timber. But that's both a crisis and an opportunity because it means we have the opportunity to plant climate adapted varieties in those locations that are going to be better adapted to surviving and thriving in the areas we plant them. Next slide, please. But there's lots of sources of uncertainty in seed selection. And I think the easiest one conceptually to think about is future climate uncertainty. We have estimates of what the future climate is going to be, but we don't know exactly what it's going to be. You can think of, one way to construct an estimate is to take the ensemble, or we can construct a probability density function using the range of global circulation models for a particular location. And we can contrast two different strategies here. So the first one, A, which you can look at in either of these graphs, the single seed source optimized for approximately the mean expected climate of that location. But you can see that's got a pretty high standard deviation, pretty high uncertainty in what the outcome is going to be if we select that one seed source. If instead we switch to a portfolio of two seed sources, so B in these figures, where we've got, say, one seed adapted to a climate a little bit warmer and a little bit colder than the mean expected climate, we can substantially reduce the standard deviation of expected outcomes. And as we move left on these figures to portfolios composed of a larger number of seeds, we can construct optimal portfolios with proportions, maybe this is like 50% seed source one, and then 10% of a bunch of different seed sources that have much lower standard deviation with minimal downside in terms of the mean expected productivity of those seed sources. Next slide. We're running low on time, so I think just skip to the next one. Yeah, so one major pain point for the nurseries, CAL FIRE, and the US Forest Service is their systems for tracking seed bank inventory are super clunky, and it's challenging for people who, like me, who work with that inventory data as well. So I think this might not be, maybe it is, exactly what you guys were thinking of focusing on, but I think it's an area where you guys, with your software engineering database skills, could bring a lot of value that would solve a lot of problems and really add value. That's it.
We don't have any time for questions, but thanks, Joe. I appreciate the presentation.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Joe. I think we have a minute or so for questions. Does anyone in person or online have any questions they'd like to ask Solomon?
That was awesome work. Thanks, Joe. Question. The question is whether you think the performance functions you've derived for growth translate to survival in harsh environments that we're increasingly seeing.
Yeah, the two tend to be pretty correlated, but we've got climate transfer functions built into CAST for both survival and for overall productivity. I think sort of the simple best way to focus is the compound transfer functions that integrate both survival and productivity, but we can also separate those out into individual transfer functions. We tend to get better overall predictions for growth rates, and survival is a little bit noisier.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Solomon. We're going to move forward to the next presentation. So help me to welcome Kyle Rodman, who's going to be talking to us about the Southern Rockies Reforestation Tool, a post-fire decision support system to support climate-smart reforestation. So take it away, Kyle.
Yeah, thank you, Libby, and thank you for the invitation to talk today. My name is Kyle Rodman. I'm a research scientist at the Ecological Restoration Institute at Northern Arizona University. Just a real quick background, ERI is a federally funded research institute focused on wildfire and forest management in the West. There are three sort of sister institutes in the Southwest in Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. Some of the Colorado folks are going to be talking a little bit later. And yeah, we are really thinking about a lot of the same issues that you all are talking about here in sort of the broader seminar and workshop today. So it's fun to sit in. It's fun to hear about the other things that are happening in other regions. You can go to the next slide there, Libby. Cool. Thank you. So I'm going to talk real briefly about a tool that we developed a couple of years back. And I won't get into the nitty-gritty too much. I'm happy to answer questions at the end or have conversations with people in the chat or whatever it is. But the tool that we developed is called the Southern Rockies Reforestation Tool. This came out of an earlier manuscript, which was essentially a data synthesis project looking at a bunch of post-fire regeneration data and establishment data in the Southern Rocky Mountains. And the locations of all those data sources are here on the map on the top right. There's a QR code in the bottom right to the report for this tool itself. I'm happy to link to the earlier paper as well. But Joe set this up really nicely. This is basically the same kind of idea that he was talking about in his initial tool for California. We sort of created a similar thing for the Southern Rockies. So the core of Colorado, Southern Wyoming, Northern New Mexico. And again, this is based on natural regeneration data rather than planted seedlings. We focus specifically on ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. They are not the most widespread species in this region, but they're the most widely planted. So it's a good focus, I think, for sort of an initial effort at this project. Can go to the next slide there. So just a quick rundown on why we designed the tool the way we did, how it works kind of in a broad sense. As a platform, we used Google Earth Engine. Google Earth Engine makes it very user-friendly and fairly straightforward to develop these interactive applications. And at least for non-commercial and academic use, they're free as well currently. So it's a pretty handy source. It's also how most people do kind of broad-scale remote sensing and GIS analysis these days. Is using Google Earth Engine. So there's lots of built-in data sets. It makes things a little bit easier for us to create some cool interactive functions where people can move sliders, change options, select areas of interest, that kind of stuff, and do fairly high-level analyses without having to understand GIS and remote sensing work. So the tool itself, you could think of it as sort of a 6-step process, and I'm not going to talk too much about each one, but the first step is basically identifying the year and the location that a fire occurred. And there's within the tool a way to basically select the area of interest and the year that you know the fire happened. Once you select that area, it generates a fire severity map kind of on the fly. And this is a really nice feature because we've had lots of conversations. Zach Holden, who's going to be talking next, and I and some other folks have talked about kind of the variation in quality of fire severity maps that people bring to the table when they do this kind of work. So if you're working with like a silviculturist on a local forest, for example, they may only have access to an initial fire severity assessment or a soil burn severity map, or some of these data sets that aren't really perfectly designed for this kind of work. So we're kind of incorporating best available mapping methods and best available data generated on the fly within the tool to do the analyses that are needed. So once the fire severity map is generated, we use these climate suitability maps, which again are generated from that previous paper and some of the statistical models that are kind of built into that analysis. We use the fire severity map to identify places that are at least 60 meters from low or moderate severity burn within a fire. We mask the climate suitability maps to those areas, and then users can optionally restrict those maps to areas based on slope angle or distance from known roads, right? So some of these more operational constraints. So that's an optional step, but this map on the bottom right is showing that. So basically we have this fire severity map for the Hayman fire based on the constraint of at least 60 meters from lower moderate severity fire patches or unburned areas, and the constraints of being close to nearby roads and being on sort of shallow gradual slopes. This is what that planting suitability map might look like. So the yellow areas tend to be sort of at the cool, wet end of ponderosa pines range within the broader region, and the purple to sort of dark blue areas are hotter and drier within the same fire. We also have a component here where you can use general circulation model outputs, and we've selected 3 general circulation models for the broader Southern Rockies that kind of bracket the range of projected future conditions. So it's a composite of those 3. And so you can basically run this analysis for either historical or projected future climate. Next slide. So a couple of planned updates. Zach's going to be talking about Region Mapper next, which is a different tool. We are actually kind of in the process of adding some of the SRT functionality to Region Mapper. So our tentative plan basically is to merge some of the functions within SRT into Region Mapper, make it get a little more user-friendly, make it able to do some things like generate the on-the-fly fire severity maps, also include a component of like predictions of delayed tree mortality. So this is a pretty important piece where if you're using 1-year post-fire imagery to estimate like the availability of seed trees, that might actually be overestimating your seed source 5 years down the road, right? As things sort of die over time with this delayed post-fire tree mortality. Next slide. Just real quickly, I was going to mention that some of the sort of learning that we've had with the implementation and use of this tool, continuous effort is really key. I think a lot of the time when people release these things, they'll put a bunch of work right up front when something comes out. And that can get some good initial use, but it doesn't really maintain use and get the word out, right? And I think Zach and others have been really good about continuing to do like webinars and workshops, get use from managers and practitioners over time. Also point out that new tools and techniques are generally shared through informal networks. So maybe you work with a silviculturist on an adjacent forest a little bit, or you know them well. If something works for you, you're likely to share it with them. And that's where people find a lot of this information rather than going out and reading scientific papers or reports or those kinds of things. Let's go to the last slide, I guess. I'm just going to skim through it real quick because I think we're pretty much out of time. I think that Planscape is planning on doing this, but one of the things that I think is really critical is trying to develop these tools that are designed for multiple land use designations or ownership categories. Right, we often develop these tools for a specific ownership, like Forest Service, for example, but there's lots of this kind of work happening on different land designations. So we might have like a minute for questions, but I'll leave that up to you guys.
Awesome. Thanks, Kyle. I'm going to pause on questions. So if you guys do have those, I do want to keep us on time. So we're going to keep rolling. Thank you, Kyle. That was fantastic. And if you do want to connect with Kyle later, I think there might be some opportunities to come up here and we can get folks who do have questions up to this virtual space to ask questions of all of the virtual presenters, either during the break or at lunch. So, all right, thanks. So continuing to roll, we're going to turn it over to Zach Holden, who is going to talk to us a little bit about Regen Mapper, which the Forest Service has adopted as one of its reforestation tools. So really excited to hear more about that. And Zach, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Libby. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, and you're controlling my slides?
That is correct.
All right, I'm going to blast through quite a few slides. I apologize for deviating from the preferred format. But yeah, I'm just going to give a quick overview of Regen Mapper. Apologize if a lot of you have seen this already. I'm going to try to just highlight things that you could take out of this program that I see as valuable, I guess. Next slide, please. So here's a link to Regen Mapper. This will take you to the site. You can go in with your Gmail account or use an email and set up an account yourself. Next slide. And you'll see here a table. This is all the historical MTBS fires we have in a database. So you can search for those and pretty easily run a job for a historical fire. Or there's an upload file feature where you can bring your own burn severity map, which is what most people do for recent fires. Next slide. And if you want more details, there's a user manual that's recently updated. That how-to video is no longer relevant, but that user manual does have quite a bit of information in it. Next slide. And basically, this is a really simple, we're just doing GIS and we're automating it. We used to do this by hand. It took us hours for every fire to pull the layers together, and so we've just automated most of that. At the core of this tool is basically species recruitment probability models based on Kim Davis's data set from her recent paper. These are just regression models that we've fit with her data. We keep them in memory, make a raster prediction for recruitment probability for the requested domain. Next slide. I'll just show quickly outputs for the Lolo Peak fire. This is one of our big fires in 2017, really kind of a wake-up call for the Region 1 for post-fire restoration. Next slide, please. And I think we all know, one of the core kind of constraints on post-fire regeneration is distance to a potential seed source, at least for a lot of species. We're now using the RAP rangeland analysis platform data as our primary source for distance to seed source information. We also have an option in there using a JEDI canopy height layer for older fires. That data set's a little dated now, so we kind of reserve it as an option. You can see, I think it's important to note there are pretty large differences for certain areas depending on which canopy cover product you use. So this is going to be one of the key inputs to any model, I think. Next slide. I think, one of the strongest things about Regen Mapper is the underlying climatic and biophysical layers that we have inside the tool. This is basically a 250-meter product I developed some years ago for CONUS. This is just showing climatic water balance deficit. A lot of work to get here to show basically differences on north versus south facing slopes and moisture and energy. Next slide. And so we've taken those 250-meter data sets just for the Western US. I've done some additional downscaling, so reproduced that at basically a 30-meter resolution. And that remapping, the methods that we use allow us to bring in a stochastic weather generator. So we have basically futures now at 30 meters for all of our water balance variables, actually just for 2050 currently. Next slide, please. And the other climatic input is something we call potential soil surface temperature. Here we've taken basically a surface energy balance model. We simulate temperatures at the ground surface, which we know affect seedling survival, and done that in basically under a very sparse canopy, assuming basically post-fire like conditions. And using that model, developed 30-meter rasters of sort of near maximum annual climatological maximum soil surface temperature. We do that for a bed of ponderosa pine seedlings. Those are the vegetation parameters we use in the model for calibration, and then produce a 2050 future based on CMIP 6 projections. Next slide. And so you can see in that, in that raster, when we zoom into Lolo Peak, there's a lot of topographic detail, and particularly you'll see that, south slopes near the ground surface are much, much hotter than north slopes. And I think, we all know working in mountains that topography plays a huge role on vegetation ecology and particularly seedling survival. So differentiating those north versus south slopes, I think, is something that's really important. Next slide, please. And then we take, basically Kim's data, fit regression models, using those climatic inputs primarily in distance to seed sources inputs, and then, make predictions for an all species model and then for 6 individual conifer species. Next slide, please. Just show a map of those here quickly. Ecologically, these make sense. Sorry I didn't label these. That's ponderosa pine in the upper left, all the way down to, I think, subalpine fir in the lower right. Next slide, please. And just again to highlight what we're getting out of these models, here's just an inset for the trailing edge for that Lolo Peak fire. And you can see contrasting historical versus 2050 projections. There is an upslope movement, a loss of recruitment probability at those lower elevations, those hotter sites. But there is, some topographic detail that's remained here. And what we're kind of starting to see in these outputs is that our future projections show north slopes being kind of, refugia, if you will, places where we retain recruitment, where corresponding south slopes are projected to lose recruitment potential. I just want to highlight we're doing this without any terrain derivatives. This is all basically using climate data, which I think is kind of a small milestone in landscape ecology. Next slide. One other thing I think is important for you guys to consider as you develop your tool, we did a lot of work to bring in the facts data. This is what the U.S. Forest Service uses for a lot of decisions. We bring those in to a prioritization scheme, and those help us identify places where we may have had a pre-existing management need. Maybe something was done where, we need to go back and plant there by law. Next slide. And just a quick note on kind of where we're headed with Regen Mapper. We have a paper that's been in review for about a month. We are currently working under a USDA AFRI project to do spatial optimization using Forces, and we have some additions that we planned through a recently funded NASA project that will start here in a couple of months. So I'm going to stop there since I'm out of time. Next slide, just real quick, Elizabeth. And we have some great tablet tools, folks. The Forest Service is going out, they're doing surveys with tablets. If we could interface those with a tool dynamically to adjust our maps, I think that would be really powerful. And that's it.
Thanks, Zach. Any questions online that you were put in the chat, Charlie?
No questions, just Kyle giving us some links about where his paper and tool are.
Awesome. Any questions from the audience here in the Google Community Room? Great. Any questions from online? I see one in the chat.
Sarah Anderson wants to know, which species do you have models for now?
Let's see, ponderosa pine, Doug fir, western larch, Pinus concolor, subalpine fir, and grand fir, I believe.
Great. Any other questions? You guys are pros on Regen Mapper now. Love it. Okay. Thanks, Zach. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
All right, we will move on to a presentation from Michelle Jeffries, who's with USGS, and she's going to be talking to us about accessible adaptive management, an introduction to the land treatment exploration tool. So take it away, Michelle.
Okay, thank you. And did you test to see if my videos work?
I did, and they should be, yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to be talking to you from the perspective of a tool built in collaboration with the Bureau of Land Management. So it's going to be a little bit of a paradigm switch because most of BLM lands aren't actually forested. And so some of the information that I'm going to show that our tool does is more tailored towards a rangeland's perspective, but it gives a really good example of a co-produced tool hand in hand with land managers that is being actively used by land managers to help with their adaptive management of treatments. Okay, next slide. So this is a publicly available website, and it's an interactive tool that allows, oh, so my transitions didn't work though. Okay. Interactive tool for resource managers to plan their treatments, and it's sort of a one-stop shop for information for the BLM. But again, this is a publicly available web source. Anyone can use this, and it helps them understand the ecological context of their area. So it provides them with a bunch of summary information, pulling from publicly available data sources. It identifies fish and wildlife species of conservation concern, like migratory birds that might be in the area or threatened or endangered species. It's going to help them gather information about past and future drought conditions at their specific site. And it's going to allow them to identify and learn from past restoration investments that the BLM has made in the area. Next slide. Okay, weird. So this is what the tool looks like. On the left-hand side, there are 6 steps that it's just going to very easily walk someone through. And then that big middle portion where there's a map, that's where a lot of the interaction is going to display for people. Lots of maps, summaries, and figures as they step through each of the steps. So it's a very easy interactive tool to step through. Next slide. Maybe.
Okay. Oh, it was working earlier.
Okay, I have it pulled up. Can I steal the screen share?
Yeah, I think that should work. I'm sorry. Oh, wait, is this it? Yeah. Okay, does that work?
Sure. Okay. So this is showing some data layers that we display. So we have over 60 different data layers that people can just explore. And so this is showing past restoration treatments by the BLM over there on the right side, and then some layers from the Forest Service coming from that FACTS database that was just mentioned here on the left. So most of the tool specifically interacts with the BLM data, but we do display that Forest Service data. And we show information about the area, past disturbances with those treatments. We linked treatment details. We show past fire history with frequency. We show past vegetation through time, through remote sensing lens. So what has the ground look like from the satellite's perspective? And we also show past monitoring data that exists in and around this area. So this is coming from the BLM AIM data set. Forest Service data is not publicly available in the same way. And we show the details about those treatments. So, you know, like what type of species were observed there. We also show those species of conservation concern. So this is linking into the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service information for planning and consultation tool that gives a bunch of information about those special status species and migratory birds of conservation concern. We also have some historic and future drought information. This is showing a projected 1 year of soil moisture at this study location. And we can toggle that to different depths of soil moisture. So depending on what you're seeding or planting, they might require different depths of available soil moisture. For sagebrush, we also, oh, it's supposed to pause there. Do you mind if I take over screen share? That's a little, might be, or can you just like click to the last?
Yeah.
And pause
So,
because normally in presentations, it just stays on the last. Okay, maybe this won't work. Well, what that was going to show you and pause on was for some specific species. Right now, we just have sagebrush. We tie into some past literature on potential species establishment, and we're working on models for some commonly seeded forbs and perennial grasses as well. So you can go ahead and click to the next slide.
sorry about that.
That's okay. It just interacts differently on Google.
Yeah.
Department of the Interior, we can't use Google things, so
Yeah, I hear
I
that.
work in the Microsoft land.
I do too. In case that wasn't abundantly clear. All right.
Okay,
What's the
so
next-
later on in the tool, it will link into past restoration investments done by the BLM, searching by some ecologically relevant area. So I believe I did the search by the ecological site, and we can pull up information about those past treatments, such as the details written down about them, their remotely sensed vegetation cover through time, and things like seed lists, so that you can find past treatments that may or may not have worked that you can use as citation for, I want to do a treatment like this. It worked in the past. I'm hoping it'll work here again. Here are some seed species. You know, this other treatment failed. I'm not going to do it like this treatment. They did not have success. So looking into what we know about what's been done in the past to make better informed decisions moving forward. Go ahead and click the next slide. And so what this tool does as an output is it creates a site characterization report. And the first page of this report gives you just a summary map with the BLM treatments on here. So the fire polygon in this example with those treatments. And then the subsequent sections include, go ahead and click, I guess these, cool. Throughout the tool, users are encouraged to write notes. And so these are notes that I would have taken if I were planning a restoration project for this fire. Go ahead and click next slide. And then there are 27 different summary sections where the tool automatically generates these maps as well as tables of your specific polygon overlaid with a bunch of data like seed zones, ecological site names, land fire vegetation cover, so on and so forth. Next slide, or next click. And at the end of this report, it's going to include any of those monitoring treatments or those past, monitoring plots or past treatments that you included for your report. Next slide. So what we know, lessons learned, this tool has been very successful with the BLM, and that's largely because we co-produced it with them and we've had them at the table the entire time. We have capitalized on a lot of existing infrastructure, so tying into publicly available data sources and not recreating the wheel and trying to connect via API everywhere we can. And this also helps to avoid tool overload. Some of you might be feeling overloaded just from the last 3 presentations. A lot of great information out there. And dedicated outreach and training has been emphasized for other tools as well, but you have to keep on your soapbox with these tools to keep it on everyone's radar. And just one of the negative things that we've learned is that it's very hard to do things like this, especially working in the cloud. It's very expensive and very difficult. So keep that in mind when you are thinking about these types of projects. Next slide. One thing we should build. So I'm hoping that through this wonderful meeting, we can create some connections to collaborate with some of these existing tools to expand upon the utility of other tools as well as ours and kind of cross-pollinate everyone's projects. And that should be it.
Thank you, Michelle. We do have a couple of minutes for questions. Charlie, are there any in the chat?
Nope, just another link being shared. I get.
Great, thanks.
How widely adopted is
How widely
is this tool being taken up?
How widely adapted is the tool, Michelle?
Yeah, so the BLM is actually mandated to use it when they're requesting funds for post-wildfire restoration. So all of the BLM folks who are doing post-fire restoration.
That's amazing, thanks. Any other questions, either from virtual folks or in the room? Great, I'm gonna pass you a mic really quickly if that works.
I really appreciate all the context on Plantscape, and I'm curious for maybe a little more on the sort of structure of the management of including especially the ideas that come out of today. Like, is the team like poised to start coding right away, or is it like gathering ideas to sense the scope of how much labor is needed, and then is there funding already, or is that sort of a next step? And yeah, that sort of context for how poised are we to tackle this immediately?
Everyone's pointing at me, so I'm going to try and answer. I'm Rob. I work at Sega on Plantscape. More of the latter than the former. Like Plantscape, like nobody owns Plantscape. It is truly a collaborative. There's no IP. There's no ownership. The governance groups, straddles, all those organizations that Carrie presented on that slide. So state, federal, philanthropic, sort of private. You know, we know this is important. We're hearing it from users, so we know we're going to build it. We don't, like, today is really the start of the journey, so we don't know what the what is, I think. You know, so so we have some funding to certainly get through exploration. I think there's a great appetite from the people around the table and potentially other people to sort of continue that funding as we go forward. So it partly depends on the shape of whatever comes out of this. Like, what do we collectively think we should build, and who's it most useful for? You know, then we have to think about how that funding is. But certainly we're funded into sort of the exploration part of this. But it's a cooperative, so think of it as yours, if you like. Like it's this group of people are going to shape what that is, including how do we fund it.
Awesome. Thank you. Michelle, thank you so much. Really appreciate the presentations. And if everyone could join me in giving a round of applause for Joe, Kyle, Zach, and Michelle.